In this lesson, I would like to talk about coding with cables. So far, we've seen a lot of ops and techniques that hopefully would get you started and have a really robust understanding of the framework. But of course, there are many more ops that you need to discover and play with and inspect from other projects. But what if you need to, get your hands dirty and try to expand cables? That's what I do all the time, and I will try to show this to you throughout this small series, basically. So we have many topics to cover, but it is not a pure JavaScript introduction. I will link and show you references. Actually, I have them right here. If you really want to know and learn about the language itself, it's a full programming language out of the scope of this video, but I invite you to go on this free book called You Don't Know JavaScript, You Don't Know JS Yet. And they already have the first and second edition. It is a community effort, and as you can see, is one of the most starred project ever on the GitHub. And you have really everything to know the language in depth. It's really good. Also, you also have the Mozilla development path, or you have also everything you need to know from HTML, CSS, and JavaScript here. JavaScript first steps that would be of interest. Many videos online for sure. It's one of the most popular languages in the world, so it's not hard to find videos, but to find good content it's not that easy. So this is why I'm really strongly encourage you to look at this book and some other resources that you may find useful. This is basically the reference for all web developers, so it's also very good and strong preference for this. And of course, you have also the Cables documentation about coding ops. It's not a JavaScript tutorial, but it's we will use it as a reference for here when we learn how to create ops in Cables. So they also have all the, here are some documentation about how to create them. All right, so let's start with the basics quickly. You know that everything that we've been doing so far is basically executing code in the editor, and when you export the patch, runs in the client side, so on your browser, or even if you export the app, it can also run on the desktop as basically a fake browser. It's an Electron build, and so for you it looks like a standard desktop app, but it's actually JavaScript running in a headless window. So the first thing I would do to get started is to first switch to the dev version of Cables. So by just putting dev in front of the Cables.gl. And why it makes more sense, because we are developing ops and we want to make sure that whatever the Cables team is doing behind the scene, when the API and the whole framework updates, usually every 3-4 months, then everything that we create is going to be compatible. It's very unlikely that the dev version will break, although sometimes we have some small development issues, which makes sense because it's a dev version. But you want to make sure that you code your op here, and then when it's being updated every 3 months, then it would work in production. To create ops, we have to first remind ourselves of how Cables work in terms of namespaces. So when I open the tab editor here, you notice that on the right, I have a lot of names or folders where ops are being classified in a way. And your own name, the Cables name that you chose, is also a namespace for custom op. So op that you create, you can decide to put them under your name, and so they will be basically accessible for all the projects you are in. You can also decide to create a team of users and optionally assign ops to a team. So now you need to be part of the team to access the ops. And it can be useful if you co-work with someone on a project, and you've, or like a development feature, or you want to hide, protect your app from other Cable users, you can do a theme. So let me show you how to quickly create a theme. It's very simple. You go back here to Cables. You can go My Themes, or here My Themes, it's the same. And when you click on the themes, you have created a new theme, and this is where you need to check whether you want to create ops for this theme. The themes have 3 levels of accessibility permission, basically. Either the theme is public and people can ask to join them, or they are unlisted and you need the URL to request access, or they are private and it's only by invitation. So if I go back to my Cables page, I have themes, I have my own user, but by default, and it makes more sense, when I go here and I want to code a new app, this is where I go, you notice that the namespace will be patch, so the P and the ID of our patch, so that the app here can be shared to everyone, because I don't need any external dependencies or permission to be able to access the code and thus run it on the patch. So that makes sense that by default, if you want to share a patch publicly, everything has to go into the patch namespace. Now the difficult part, how are we gonna name our app? And of course it depends on what you want to do. So here I want to start with a very simple example, and I wanted to add 3 numbers. So would be some, we have some that already exist, but some 3 could be of interest. And I already made the app as a test. So the cool thing with Cables, they will tell me, hey, the app already exists, but you can create a new version, like an improved version, and then automatically people will be prompted to upgrade to the new version. This is exactly how they do it when they want to upgrade the apps that you already use. So you can decide on your editor to upgrade to the latest version. But here, so let's imagine I'm going here and I'm clicking, entering. It would be the same as putting here some 3. And you notice that now my namespace is patch and the patch ID. This is what happens when you create a new app. It's a blank square, and it's a bit weird because usually you have inputs and outputs, but it would be basically how we have to code them, and we have to decide how to make a micro API, if you think about it, because all apps have inputs and outputs, and they act like a black box from the outside. Of course, you can edit the code and see it, but conceptually, you want to have inputs, do some computation, and create outputs. So, I mean, if it's a sum, we know how to what we want to create. If it's 3 numbers, so technically we will need 3 numbers as input and 1 output number. If you want to get, of course, inspired, and I strongly encourage you to do so, we can steal the code of sum2, like the op that we have by default, inspect the code, and decide that, okay, now I want to copy part of it, manage opcode and view code, and copy some things and modify. This is what I do all the time. When you code an app, you also need to make sure that the code is running correctly. And the way to do this is to open the development console, so to be able to inspect, and we already seen that for a network request, or also if the code is like failing or working correctly. The shortcut is Command Shift and Control Shift and I, or Command Shift I on Mac. You can also go here to open the more tools and then developer tools, which is the same, and it will create this small console here. You go to console, you can clear the output, and now we have access to a JavaScript environment. We can code and modify anything we see on the page from here. This is actually how extensions work for your browser. For instance, the ad blocker, you said, hey, basically inject your ad blocking code in all the web page that I visit. It's exactly the same technique, But here, of course, we don't need to do that because Cables has an editor built in. So we want to save our op. It goes to the Cables server so that you can reload, edit the patch, and so forth. But just to explain that here you have access to the regular JavaScript and you can interact with your page. So I'm going to minimize that and put it here just to make sure that everything goes smoothly. If I open my op here, I click edit or manage and I open the editor here. The code that I'm going to type here will be run when the patch is running. So even without putting some input and output ports, it's useless for Cables. But just to show you, I'm going to type something to write in the console. So to write here some message. Hello world. Most common thing we type when you're starting and developing. If I'm saving the op, when I save it, it's automatically reloaded. And if I go here on like old messages, I should see here hello world. If I open this a bit more, you know, okay, this is this op. So the namespace of this op. And even if I click, I can look at the line. So you can also inspect and see how Cables is wrapping the ops into its own basically software. And so you have attachment. What matters is this. This is the code that we typed here, and this is the Cables wrapping on top of it. So you can always inspect and see things if you want to develop and inspect some libraries there. But just to show you the hello world here. So this code, if I reload the page, so let me make sure I save the page, the patch, and I reload it. Now, of course, it's going to be executed as well. So we should see some hello world somewhere. And I don't see it, but it should appear somewhere. Ah, yeah. I didn't save. So what I did is this is important. Good call. I saved the op, but I didn't save the op in the patch. So if I put back my sum3, now I see my hello world, but just to make sure I need to save in the patch the fact that I added the op in the patch. So now if I reload the patch, I should see the op and the hello world somewhere here. Makes sense. So just make sure that two things. I'm saving here in the editor, and I'm saving in the code editor, and I'm saving in the editor here itself to put the op. Okay. All good. Now, okay, we know that if we create ops, we need to have input and output. And as I said before, we need to think of the API. And we know simply that we need 3 numbers. So how do I create a number? Import. Everything that you do related to the ops themselves, like the UI to create a port, is going to be under the op object. So in JavaScript, we know what an object is now because we play with those in Cables without actually really looking at the syntax, but it's very similar to what we've been doing so far. So it should not be that complex to switch from the visual environment to the text environment. Here, I'm going to create a port. And I'm going to explain. I'm going to type and I'm going to explain what each of these words mean. So I'm going to declare a number, port. And as I said, everything related to the op itself and the editor, it's under the object op. So I'm going to type in number, in value, it depends. So if I'm not sure what to use, this is where the coding ops is interesting. I want to create a port of type, not integer actually, I want floating point numbers. And they say, okay, in float or in number, but float is better because we expect the numbers to be not only integers, but float. So we have a float here, and I'm going to call this number A. Let me start saving again and explain. I'm creating an op here and a port name number A. That's the name here. So when I click on my op, it's there. It's going to be of type float. And I know from Cables that what we use, we have numbers, we have booleans, we have integers, we have strings, we have objects, we have textures, we have arrays. So this is defined here, but not the array. I mean, not the texture, but it's there. It's an object, type of object. And I'm just basically copy pasting what Cables expect for me to create the port. And I'm saying, okay, I'm put this in a variable. So the port needs to, this is the name that we put, but in code, this is where we need to reference the port. And this is a constant value because the port will never change. It's gonna be for the whole code that I use here. I will not override the port. I just want to reference this one as something that never changes. So I call it const for constant value. I already have one port. Okay, if I want to make 2 and 3 ports, I can simply copy and paste, and of course change the name, because if I use the same name, I'm overwriting something that is constant, so it cannot work. So I'm going to call number B. And something very important, which is not written in the doc, is that here the name of the port needs to be different as well. If it's not different, you're going to have some trouble, like a lot of issues when you save the patch and the op. So make sure that whatever you type here in the text, because all the ports have some text, they are all different from each other. Very important. So I'm just copy paste, and if I save, now automatically you see I have 3 ports. Okay, cool. Now I need an output port. We didn't really write what we're gonna do with it. So I always start, and this is how you should do it. You should always start with the inputs and outputs. So to make a comment in JavaScript, you have to double slashes, and I'm gonna call this inputs. This is just for us. It's not being executed by the machine. Here, output, because I only need one output. Once again, I'm naming this output, and by the way, this is my convention, I mean Cables convention. I could have called this A. I don't need to type it. It's any name that I want that I can reuse in my code. But I think it makes more sense to always use in, because it's an import, and then whatever you want to put as text, you put it, but you cannot put spaces. So I just copy and paste it here. It's called camel case. You can also search online, or what I would suggest is to use ChatGPT to ask, hey, how can I do this? What is camel case? And it will be very handy if you have the GPT-4 version, or better, depend on when you watch the video. Really use the interpreter mode and have some kind of step-by-step. You can always copy and paste code and ask ChatGPT to explain to you what it means. You can also ask ChatGPT to code for you, but for now we're learning the basics, so you need to understand what you want, because it still makes mistakes. Coming back to our output, now I can name it however I want, but I'm following the same convention. So I'm gonna use out, because I know it's an output, and we can call it out result or whatever you want. And once again, I need to create an output port. So it's going to be below the op object, out, and then what I want is a number. And I'm going to call it result. So if I save and I type something that doesn't exist, for instance, I'm not sure that out float exists. You see? So this is a bit of a naming convention. This is why I hesitated at the beginning. I was out in value, but you have in float to have a more precise thing, but it doesn't really exist the out float. So I would there's an error here, and I can always change and call it out number, because I know it's a number. And you save and you can reload the patch. Usually when you have a crash, you need to reload the patch. And here it works all good. So you notice that I put the out number. I say, okay, I want to, the output is going to be a number. This is once again purely a convention, but it's a good convention. Put your inputs, put your output, and now we have to do something, because now we are holding inside this the number that we're going to put, and here we need to set it to a result. By default, the number is set to 0, but we're not doing anything. We've just basically created variables inside with code, but we didn't run any function, right? We didn't call any op, if you will, inside here. So we need to create a function, and this is the core of programming. How do I declare a function in JavaScript? There are two ways, and one simpler, both have their merit, but the most basic way is to type a reserved keyword called function. And then the name of your function, so it's like the name of the op. We can call this maybe add, because we want to add numbers. So this, it's not finished yet. To be complete, a function needs parentheses to have some arguments, so some inputs of this function, and then the body, which needs to be in curly braces. So this is basically declaring a function which doesn't do anything yet. And in parentheses, it's exactly like when you call an op. Here I need 3 numbers, so in this function I would need 3 inputs, right? This function has nothing to do with the variables that we created here. So I can call this A, B, and C. And now do something. So if you think about it, what would you do to add 3 numbers? Well, it's like if you type on your regular calculator, right? So I need to do A plus B plus C and put a semicolon at the end. Technically, it's not needed, but I encourage you to do it for good practice. But if I add this, okay, I'm adding, and I'm not saving the result. I'm just adding in the computer's memory, but then it's not being returned. It's not being output back to me. So the way to do this in the function is to say, hey, I'm returning. So I'm doing whatever computation, and then I'm returning it back to you. If I want to do a more complex computation, I'm not going to create 200 lines of code with one return. So I can decide to save the result here. So I'm going to create a new variable here that I call res. I'm adding the things, putting it back in res, and then returning this back to the function, back to whoever called me. So I created a small function, but this function is not being called anywhere. It exists and can do stuff, but I need to test whether it works by actually putting A, B, and C. And this is also why I put the different names here. These have nothing to do with this. I could have called this pig, pug, and pug. Right? It doesn't matter. Now, if I want to call this function, I need to replace these values when I call it. So with the numbers that I get from Cables. How do I do this? Well, Cables has a interesting way of watching variables. You notice that in Cables, I can play with this and I can slide values, and it seems that when I do it, everything reacts and it's completely automatic. I don't need to necessarily click on a button for everything to move. I just need to modify to change the value. So the ports here are more than just a number. This is why I said, well, we need to call the cable special function. Basically, this is a function, and it creates the port, but also does something else. It creates an object with the inside the function that is called onChange. So this function is basically telling whenever the port value has changed, I'm gonna run this whatever code you give me. So it's up to me as a developer to bind, it's called, to call the right function according to if one of my inputs change or not, but I can decide to do it. I'm going to show you two ways. The first one, of course, is to say if the number A is changing. So the function is called onChange. What happens if this function changes? Well, I need to call my function add, right? I want to add the number. So I can say, okay, I'm calling my function add if this number changes. But in my function add, I need 3 inputs. And here I didn't say add of these values. I don't know how to pass the values here. I don't know how to get them. So it needs to do something a bit different. So if I want to do it right, I would do something like this. Function on number A changed. Because in Cables, the onChange function cannot have any arguments. Can only be empty like this. So if it's empty now in this function, I need to get back the numbers and then add my function called my add function. So I can say, okay, give me now the values of number A. So to get the number inside of any port, we use the get function. And for people who know how to code it, technically it's called a method, right? But it's just the same. It's calling a function on this port, getting the value here, A. But I need 3 things. I need to also get B and C, because I need to add 3 things. So I'm just changing this. I'm getting my 3 numbers, and now I can I can say add and add A, B, and C. Just to be clear, I'm going to change this to X, Y, and Z to highlight that these are a local variable that has nothing to do, it doesn't need to be the same name. So just to make sure, think of this as exactly like values that we put in the ports here. They don't need to be called the same. When I call this function, so when I put add and the parentheses, I'm running this function, and I know that this function needs to return a value. So I need to capture the return value here. So I can say, and this also, I can call it res, also to highlight, once again, this is explained in details in all the books in JavaScript, to make sure that the names here are completely, it's fine that they're the same names, because when you create something inside the function, you are basically creating a new scope so that the names of the variables are only local to this function. Whereas when you create numbers or variables outside the function, then the 2 or xever function you put below can access this number. So this is called the scope, and this is why if you go to the book here, the scope is one of the first lessons. Just to highlight this. So I'm saving the code, but nothing will happen yet, because even if this number changes, I'm getting back my result, but I'm not setting my output, right? My output is still whatever result. I didn't replace the output value 0 here with the result of this. So in one way we get the value to set something. Well, it's simple, it's called set value. So I'm setting the result to be the result of my addition here. So let's try it. I'm changing, and I'm saying, okay, when this changes, I'm adding a new value, but check it out. I'm moving this, nothing changes, because I didn't actually bind the function. So only when the number A changes, I'm doing the addition. So now if I change, I modify the value a bit. This function onNumberChange is being called. I'm fetching back the 3 values, adding, setting the result. So we know that if we want everything to react, I need to copy and paste this function for all my numbers here, my 3 numbers. So what I could do, and it would be very bad practice, would be to copy and paste and say, on number B changed, on number C changed. But of course, if you see this, you see how ridiculous it is, because you are copy and pasting. We never copy paste code. If you want to reuse a functionality, you can create a function that you call from different points, but you don't copy paste code. So how would you change this? Well, what if I call this onNumber change? Because irrelevant of the number, I always want to run this code. So if I call this onNumber change, now I can copy and paste just this line here to bind different function for different ports. For number B, for number C, I always want to call this function. Now I'm saving, and when I move any of these numbers, everything reacts correctly. So that's pretty good. Now, if you don't want to copy and paste, it's something you would see often in ops, is that you can also chain it like this. It's a bit less readable, but you would see it's exactly the same. I'm basically assigning and say, if this one equals this one equals this one, and then I'm calling the final function. You can all break the line here if you want, which is exactly the same thing. You would see that I'm showing you what you would see. I think it's simpler at the beginning just to copy and paste and really change the port. You cannot, for each port you have to assign the function. So you can copy and paste here and make sense, but not the actual computation of what you want to do with the op. Okay, and what if this is not a number? What if I put a string? You know, when you create ops, you always have to account for the worst. In most cases, you would be your own enemy because you would create pass wrong values. It's called defensive programming. It's basically the way of handling errors and issues. So, yeah, what if I put a string here? Let's try. So here, by putting a float, the op itself said, okay, you cannot put a string, so I convert this to undefined. But what if I move this here? Now, it's a bit weird. Is undefined being transformed to 0, which I think it's what it's doing, but it's not very clear. So how would you, you have to make sure that the number is a number, for instance. So fortunately, there is a way to do this, and there is a thing that's called isNaN, and isNaN means nan means not a number, basically. So it also invites us to check for something, and exactly as we did with before when I showed the control flow, if something is true, then do this. If it's not true, then do something else. This is called a condition in programming. And you have, of course, we have this. It's one of the most basic things in the world. So you can say if I'm going here. If x, so I need to call basically it's a function. So like add, but it's called isNaN. I'm putting my value here, and this will return true or false. So if it's nan, then I'm in trouble because it's not a number. So what if it's not a number? What do I do? That is up to us. Do I replace this number by 0? Do I put the result to not a number? Because if you technically add not a number with something else, the result should be not a number. But in cables, if you put a not a number, it will probably break the next op. So you could say, if it's not a number, then I'm going to put this to 0. I'm going to put x to 0, for instance. But it's a choice. There is no right or wrong answer. It really depends on how you create your own API and error handling. If it's not a number, I want to set x to 0. But what did I say before? I put this as a constant value. So once this is assigned, once I put the content of a in x, I cannot modify x anymore. So if I want to be able to modify X, I need to use another keyword called let. And it will tell JavaScript, okay, this variable here can change. So I'm getting the number, and if it's not a number, then X, I put 0 inside. Okay, now I can do the same thing for Y. So you can say, but you told before that you're not copy and pasting, but now I see you copy paste the conditions. So generally the rule of thumb is like if you need to copy more than 3 lines, you need to make a function. But here it's already actually condition and a function, so it's going to be difficult to make it shorter actually. So it's a bit ugly, but this is one way. And notice that the if, it's exactly like a function needs a scope and it's like curly braces to say this is what is inside. And also it means that I don't really need to care about the else. Like, what if it's okay, it's not a number, it's not a number, so it's a number. Well, I already put the number here, right? So I don't need to check for this condition. And you see, because I didn't change the const, they say, hey, attempting to override, which is constant, which is wrong then. So I need to also put this as let and let here. I'm saving code, and of course nothing should change, right? If I put none, it's Cables is protecting us because in the float code here it's already checking. But if we connect a port and for whatever reason it goes through with the not a number, then here we have handled this case. So you see that for a simple addition, which is something that if you really want to code in one line, it would be this, a plus b plus c. We need to make sure that we first declare the inputs, the output, binding the onChange method here, like the functions, read the numbers, pass it to our function, and setting the result. Right? The other alternative would be no, if it's not a number, then I would set my result to not a number, for instance. Okay, so that was a lot. I mean, I really hope that you have watched a tutorial on JavaScript first, because this is going to be what I think a bit too complex. But I hope that I managed to demystify at least the beginning of how we code ops. We've seen what? We've seen how to declare a number, like a variable, with const or let. We have seen how to create a function with function like this, and then the name of the function, how to pass arguments to a function by putting something in parentheses here, putting the computation, putting the result in the variable as well, returning. So when I call this function, it returns back to me with the result, then setting out the output. And we also did some error handling a bit, or error checking, and made sure that if something is wrong, if it's not a number, we set the variables here to 0, so they are not being added if they are undefined. We were lucky here that the float here, when I slide, seems to be okay, but it's not guaranteed that if I connected a real number that I put directly here, that it's not going to break. So here, hopefully, we have made sure that it's going to be okay. And now it's time to test the op. I mean, we already tested here, but if I just put a viz number and I modify the value here, you see that everything reacts correctly. Hope it was informative, and I'll see you in the next one.